All right, Cindy, we're back at it. We are looking at, still under the realm of pragmatics, but you're going to take us on a journey through the genres. That there are different genres in the Bible, and that we should probably know something about them in order to read them well.
And there might be more. I just, off the top of my head, just kind
All right,
of came up with these. And with Dr. Veltz's direction in his book, of course. But.
Yeah, so we'll talk about some of those different ones. And certainly an epistle is different than wisdom literature, which is different than a history, which, as we'll see at the end, is different than a parable as well, which is kind of where we're going through all this. So join us for this journey as we discuss these different genres and just kind of clue you into some things to be aware of as you read them. And all of this, again, helps us to be better readers and therefore, ideally, better preachers as well. So like and subscribe, and let's get after it.
Spit out my Lord in every way, yet I'm still welcome in the arms.
All right, so we're moving on in our discussion of, I guess, still under the umbrella of pragmatics, into the discussion of genre.
Right. I think this is a helpful kind of excursus because when we're considering these questions of what the text is trying to, like what it counts as and what it's trying to do to the readers or to the receivers, different texts do different things. And so I've always used the example of like a cookbook. You wouldn't read the cookbook, and a cookbook doesn't intend to do the same thing as, say, a book of poetry, right? In a cookbook, you have very literal language
Right.
and very specific instructions so that you can produce something.
Right.
Whereas in a book of poetry, you have absolutely non-literal language, and it's not pointing to things that maybe you can specifically call out at first glance. It's not, the intention is not that you're producing something with it. So I think those are just things that we're familiar with, great examples of how different genres intend to do different things. And when we as readers enter into that book, whatever it is, genre, we have different expectations of it. So we're not going to expect to bake a perfect cake after reading a book of poetry, right? Like nobody's going to expect that from the literature. The author didn't intend it, and the person who's reading it should not intend to do that either. So to just kind of explore some of the different genres that we come across in the Bible is sort of helpful, just as kind of a roadmap to what should I even be doing with this text. So let's just kind of like start at the beginning with Genesis. Genesis is like a classic Hebrew narrative. And so it's taking us through a story. He said, she said, they walked, those sorts of things.
Right.
And so we can understand this type of literature to be just sort of making the story from start to finish, giving us information about this journey. Something to be remembered, however, is it's a particular story. So it's not just because Genesis is about or starts with the creation of the world. The goal of that story isn't necessarily to scientifically explore everything that's ever happened since the beginning of the world. So while we're kind of like considering what this genre is doing, a narrative story, then we have to kind of consider what are the limitations of it as well.
Okay.
And what, again, like just all the things. What is the author trying to intend to communicate? What what is the reader doing with this information? So I don't know, for you, when you come across, like, especially in Old Testament, let's start there, Old Testament narrative, what are the questions that you're asking about the text? Nothing?
You're I don't know, you're asking, you want to know the storyline, the main characters, the plot,
where they just walked from.
Yeah, where they
it's
came
always
from.
nice.
Yeah.
So a lot of times, I think like geographical information is helpful in these things to kind of give us a little bit more of, meaning about what's going on, who the characters are, who they're related to, genealogies and stuff like that are very helpful. So again, in this type of literature, you're going to see different things come to the forefront of being more important maybe than in other ones.
Okay.
So moving to the New Testament, I know we just skipped a whole lot, but I think we can sort of see the Gospels in the same way too, right? So we're starting out the New Testament with these stories of movement, stories of families, stories of things that have happened that have been very important for God's people.
Yeah, example, we just in John's, I'm doing John as Bible study, and they did, the death of Lazarus happens when Jesus is out beyond the Jordan, and he goes to Bethany, and his disciples are freaked out because he's heading back towards those who want to kill him. And it's like, when you look at it on a map, it's like, he's literally moving towards his own death.
Sure.
And he stops by Lazarus's death on the way. Right? And it's kind of this.
Yeah.
So like the movement is more like seeing it, understanding where those places are, the geography of it.
Right.
It's helpful.
It's helpful, and it kind of adds color to the story, if you will. And also like the meanings of the deeds become important. The communication, like the dialogue, can be very important as well. So, those are just a couple of things in the narratives, both Old Testament and New Testament, that we can kind of look at and ask some certain questions. I think it is important to remember that these narratives were written for a particular people. So just because it's a story doesn't mean that it was a story written to us. So we still have to take those extra steps to kind of ask who the recipients of this story were.
Right.
To just sort of see it through the lens of how we can read it better.
Right.
I would also say that since we are talking about stories, we're talking about writers, individual writers. And again, this is kind of that level 3 stuff, highly speculative thing. But you can see different language, different highlights in how each author writes his own story. And so the Gospels is a great example of this, right? We have 4 Gospels, but John is kind of like this weird gospel. It sort of talks about the same things as the other 3, and it sort of doesn't. And even the other, the first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they have a lot of things that match up, but sometimes they say things differently as well. So another helpful thing just to remember is, especially when we're dealing with literature, is sometimes you should let the author speak his way before you start reaching into the other narratives and things like that. While those things are helpful, just realize what you're doing. And it's helpful in this case to think about it like any literary work.
Sure. I always remind the folks in Bible studies, like, let's allow this author to tell their story.
Yes.
Before we go filling in the holes.
Yes. Right. I know there's a lot of there's a lot of kind of theology done simply by filling in all the holes, right? And so you're trying to get to like this real Jesus or something like that, which I mean, in theory, it's not the worst thing ever, but I think it is important to realize what we're dealing with these different stories, and like you said, let the author sort of tell his own story. Okay, so that's one. Again, I really like Dr. Voelz's breakdown in his What Does This Mean book for this. This is, again, chapter 12 about pragmatics, but he goes through a specific analysis of these genres. So if you are more interested in any of them, I do recommend you looking at his book here. So let's think where we're at. We did narratives. Yeah. And so we could say like the history, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, Chronicles. I mean, that would probably fall in a narrative-ish category, giving us a lot of the history of God's people. But then we get, in the Old Testament, this group of writings called wisdom literature.
Right.
And it shifts how you're going to read it. Right. Because all of a sudden we're dealing with like non-literal language, we're dealing with poetry, we're dealing with psalms, prayers, those sorts of things, little tiny pieces. And it's not necessarily telling this nice journey of a story anymore. It might be, different times, different places, different authors. Like Psalms is written by a bunch of different authors, all kind of pressed into this book. You have Song of Songs, which is like nobody even knows what to do with that.
Right. Yeah.
And Job, they don't even know if that was a real guy.
Yeah, it's just no timestamp at all. It just kind of drops down.
Yeah.
Got this incredible story. Yeah.
So when dealing with wisdom literature, you kind of have to just realize that this is more like a book of poetry. A lot of it is in poetic form,
Sure.
which gives you clues already. Yeah. In the Hebrew, when you're reading it, they drop out all kinds of things like definite articles and nice little words that would help you understand it a lot better. So even in the form itself, it turns into something different. So like the cookbook and poetry analysis, when you're reading something like Proverbs or Psalms or something, you're not necessarily looking for a linear start to finish story of something, but rather you're trying to understand what the author is doing with this literature, and it could be different for each one of those as well. But,
okay.
So just non-literal
Wisdom literature is its own thing. That's what you.
I would. Yes. A lot of people have different designations for all of these things, so don't take my absolute word for it.
Yeah.
And so then we get in the Old Testament. Stop me if I'm missing anything. I'm just kind of thinking through. We get a bunch of prophets.
Yep.
And prophets are crazy.
Crazy.
I mean, they're not crazy. Like they're speaking the truth, but they're kind of crazy. It kind of goes along with what you would expect in wisdom literature, but a lot of times prophets are telling a story. And they're giving commands, and they're like speaking the words of the Lord, to people. So you can kind of see them as preachers in this situation. So it's a genre all of its own,
right?
With trying to understand what are we supposed to get out of this, because it is set in a specific time, in a specific place, with specific people, unlike the wisdom literature that we kind of experienced earlier. Right. So we can kind of look at that historical surrounding data information, but that's not the only thing that it's talking about. We're going to have a whole nother section that we talk through prophecy a little bit more, because it's kind of weird, and right. I don't think we experience a lot of prophetic literature today right. outside of the Bible, and so it's something that maybe we're not really familiar with. Right. What do we do when we come across it? But just heads up, that's a little bit different. We see it in the Old Testament with the prophets, talking about their things. And then we see it in the New Testament, definitely Revelation. And, if you just look at how many different interpretations of Revelation there are out there.
So would you I remember learning they would classify like Revelation as apocalyptic literature. Is that that falls under prophecy?
I would think so.
That's the way you classify
because you could say that about many of the prophets,
sure,
like Daniel and things like that. So I think some are again more focused in a direction than others.
Sure, okay.
But it's all kind of I think it all kind of falls under the same thing. Okay, so that's kind of the Old Testament in a nutshell. And then we talked about Gospels a little bit in the New Testament. And a huge piece then of the New Testament is the epistle.
Reading other people's mail.
Yeah, the epistles.
Right.
So we get this from Paul, where he's writing to people, talking about real specific things. Things that, we might have a clue about, we might not have a clue about. Different than prophecy, different than a narrative.
Sure.
But it is a particular church in a particular place with particular, like you can, again, just reading something like that. He sends his greetings to special people. He talks about who he's baptized, it's a real thing, a real letter. And, just the history of how these letters were preserved. They were read aloud in churches and kind of passed along to the Christian churches. So these words of, so a letter from Paul, let's just say, there's other letters too, would be words of what? Words of exhortation sometimes.
Instruction, clarification. So we get like a lot of our doctrinal distinctions, things like that, because he's breaking it down. It's not telling the narrative of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. He's he's informing them of what a follower of Christ then believes.
Sure.
Whereas hope is what their life ought to look like, right?
Mm-hmm.
How one lives as a follower of Christ, all that stuff. So
Yes.
instruction, exhortation. Yeah.
Now, letters, I think, the epistles and things like that, can be just as slippery as anything else. Because, again, we have this tendency where we want to just take what Paul said and slap it on our churches at our time right now. But we still have to do the work of realizing what he's saying, what the intended response in this kind of situation is. And then this is, on the other side of the cross and things like that. So there is Jesus in the picture. We have that language and we kind of know things. But we still have to realize that, we're not the first century church.
Yeah.
And so...
a classic example is like the head covering thing.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, sure.
It's like he's pretty firm about this. And you're like, okay, does that mean all women have to cover their heads?
Now,
Right? And it's like, well, you got to unpack what did that mean to have your head covered or not have it covered, right? And what was being said or confessed in those actions. So there's work to be done.
yes.
To apply this text to today. It's not, like you said, it's not just a slap it in
Right.
today.
And the connection always becomes these speech act forces. What does this count as for these people? And what's the intended response?
Right.
That's the connection that then we bring, kind of into our understanding of what's going on here. Not that it doesn't relate because, Paul lived in a different society and these aren't our people.
We're not saying that.
Not saying that at all. Like he is speaking truth and truth still applies to us today.
Right.
Now, how do we speak that truth in a way that reflects what the truth actually is, and not, because we know that it will be specific for his congregation and his place, and it still applies, but is specific for our congregation and our place as well. And one more, I totally missed it because we're going to talk about it in a little bit. So, okay, we got the epistles. The only other thing I think we could probably highlight, which is huge in the New Testament, are the parables that Jesus speaks about. We find those in the Gospels, of course. But this is where Jesus speaks with highly non-literal language, metaphors, and similes and things like that. So in the middle of these stories of where Jesus was going and what he was doing and things like that, we have these like crazy...
So this is genre within genre.
I think so. I think we could call it that.
Yeah, but it is right. So as you're reading along... and you get to a parable, it's like this is going to require you to ask some different questions to the language.
Because it's not just, considering what Jesus did among his people while he was, walking on the earth, but now Jesus is actually saying things to people. He's teaching. Yeah. And so his teachings, again, he's not looking at us and pointing his finger and saying these words to us. So we need to understand, we need to try to understand what the point is. And this is really quite difficult because of just the nature. I mean, he's speaking in, basically poetry and images and things like that.
Right.
So to try to figure out, what the referent there is and what we can understand his words to mean for us. Just a couple things that we should
And again,
consider.
it's not like this is impossible. It's a matter about recognizing that. So in order to be faithful, you're trying to ask better questions of yourself and of the text, so you can get closer to being that faithful reader.
Yeah, being honest with what you're dealing with.
Right.
I think it'll at least direct us in the way that we're not just imposing what we think this should mean. We're actually doing some work to try to figure out what God's word is saying to us.
Yeah. So if nothing else, this book, the Bible, is it's not just one thing.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
It is the Word of God, we would say, of course, but it is not. It is a lot of different genres.
Yes.
And each one brings with it its own characteristics that you have to be aware of in order to read it better. And so you got to be able to move and shift with that. and you might ask different questions of poetry than you're going to ask of, the histories in First Kings.
I will say, I think that part of the cool thing is it all talks about the same thing.
Yes.
Like, it all points to Christ. And so whether we're talking about, a journey in Genesis, across mountains and deserts, or an epistle that Paul is writing to a particular time in a particular place, or Revelation or wisdom literature, we're always still coming back to Christ,
Yes.
the one and only answer to all the problems.
Yes. Very good. All right. Take a minute to like and subscribe if you haven't done that yet. And check out the other videos in this series where, especially the previous one on pragmatics that kind of introduces some of this. And continue to join us. Share your thoughts below. And God bless your preaching.